Welcome to the Florida Master Naturalist Program, an environmental education curriculum designed to increase awareness and appreciation of Florida's natural resources. Your host is Dr. Marty Main, wildlife ecologist with the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. Join Marty and his special guests as they take you on a tour of Florida's spectacular natural world.
So Marty, here's a good example of a fossilized coral reef.
Coral reef is a living reef, but even when it's dead and fossilized, such as this, it performs an important role. And in fact, fossilized coral reef forms the structural platform for many of the Florida Keys, such as here at Marathon. With me today is John Hunt. He's the director for the South Florida Regional Laboratory for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. How you doing, John?
I'm doing great, Marty, and it's great to have you here with me.
Thanks. John, I understand that the Florida Reef Tract is the only living coral reef on the continental shelf of North America.
That is very true. Now, the living coral reef here in the Keys is about 6 miles to the south of us, and it stretches for over 200 miles from the Tortugas west of Key West all along the Keys to north of Miami.
I understand that our coral reef is pretty diverse too. Over 100 species of corals have been identified.
There are over 100 species of corals. Some of those corals are classified in a group that are called hard corals, and those hard corals form the actual structural component and build the reef itself. And there's another group of corals, soft corals, sea fans, and there are also sea whips and other kinds of soft corals that live out there.
Now, those soft corals sometimes actually look like plants, but in fact they're not plants.
No, that's true, they're animals.
And although corals are animals, some corals have a relationship with plants, specifically with algae.
They do. The hard corals, such as brain corals and star corals, have an association with an algae that lives inside the coral colony, and those algae are called zooxanthellae and provide some of the food for the growth of the coral itself.
Now, when you have two organisms living together, such as the zooxanthellae and the corals, that's called a symbiotic relationship, which simply means two organisms living together for mutual benefit. John, the corals themselves are diverse, but the habitat component they provide, the ecosystem, also supports a very diverse community.
It absolutely does. The corals create huge amounts of nooks and crannies on the reefs and support literally thousands of species, ranging from hundreds of fish species to lobsters and other invertebrates, some of which actually bore holes into the reef structure and live inside the reef. Even some of the mammals, such as dolphins, will live part of their lives on reefs. And for that matter, there are turtles that live on reefs part of the time as well.
I understand there's a couple of interesting stories about species that depend on the reef for their entire life cycle, such as the spotted lobster.
That's true. The spotted lobster, which is in the group of spiny lobsters, which includes the Caribbean lobster that is heavily fished here in Florida and elsewhere, is a very interesting reef-dwelling lobster. It lives its entire life there. And in fact, it is dependent upon some of those reef-boring organisms for habitat, because that's where the post-larvae enter into the reef at the beginning of their lives.
Now, there's some interesting stories about fish that depend on reefs as well, such as the damselfish we talked about.
Damselfish are also a full-time reef dweller, and what they'll do is they'll take some of the staghorn corals that have these branching corals, and they'll defend the tip of them where the tips often get algae growing on them, and they will defend that as a home range against other damselfish.
Mm-hmm. Now, the reef provides structural habitat that's important for many species, but even areas adjacent to the reef are critical for some species, such as the queen conch.
This is true. Behind the reef, you get these large rubble areas that are formed primarily from broken corals. And you also get grasses growing in there as well. And those back reef areas are the essential spawning habitat for queen conch. And queen conch in Florida are a protected species. No more harvest is allowed because they've declined in abundance so much.
John, there are a number of issues associated with the conservation of coral reefs.
Well, I think there are two important conservation issues. One is nutrients related to land, where the nutrients run off of land, and those nutrients can cause algae to grow on the reefs and smother the corals. And that's especially important because some of the grazers, such as the long-spined sea urchin, are now no longer there to graze those algae down. And there's global issues as well. Global warming is changing the water temperature of the tropical waters. And every time there's an El Nino that comes through this area, we have bleaching events where the zooxanthellae are expelled from the corals themselves, and some proportion of those corals end up dying from that.
What can we as individuals do to help conserve coral reefs?
Well, for those individuals that go to reefs, the common sense recommendations are simply don't cause physical damage to the reef. Don't stand on the reef, don't anchor on the reef, don't break the corals, anchor in the sand. And in a broader sense, there's so much that we don't know about reefs, and so it certainly makes sense to support the science where knowledge is going to be gained to help conservation of this important ecosystem.
When we talk about marine systems, we typically think about the organisms that live out in the sea. But the sea comes in and out with tides and creates tidal flats such as this one at low tide. And these tidal flats are extremely important for wildlife. Although many organisms move out with the tides, many stay here, such as invertebrates and small fishes, and these areas are also extremely important for shorebirds. Hey Steve, what you doing?
I'm collecting some animals for education programs in the reserve.
This is Steve Thieberge. He's the education specialist at Rookery Bay. Steve, I see you've collected some seagrass.
Yeah.
Can you tell me some of the things about this? First off, what kind of seagrass do we have here?
Well, here's a little blade of it right here. That's shoal grass. Howley dooley is the scientific name for it, and it's often found on very shallow water areas where it sometimes get exposed at extreme low tides.
I see. Are there a lot of different species of fish that live out here in the
Oh yeah,
seagrass?
seagrass beds are great places as juvenile places for nursery areas. It's also why you see a lot of wading birds in the areas, because they are coming in to feed on these small fishes that collect in these grass bed areas.
In addition to providing nursery areas for juvenile fish, many other species that are important components of both terrestrial and marine food webs can be found on intertidal grass flats. These include crustaceans, such as juvenile blue crabs, tiny grass shrimp, and spider crabs, as well as marine worms, which may leave evidence of their presence in the form of worm tubes, egg masses, and worm burrows. Tidal flats also support a diverse community of mollusks, including large predatory snails such as the lightning whelk, whose distinctive spiraling egg case may be found partially buried in the sand at low tide. Other common species include the pear whelk and the Florida crown conch. Several unusual creatures also may be found, such as the ragged sea hare, which is actually a large sea slug, and the horseshoe crab, which is not a true crab, but actually more closely related to spiders. Research is an important component of fisheries management. And when we talk about research, we can look at two levels, the community level and individual populations. And today we're going to do both. With me are Brent Winter and Ron Taylor, both fisheries biologists for the Florida Marine Research Institute. Are we about ready, Brent?
Yeah, Marty, we're pretty much loaded. We have a small seine, a 70-foot seine. We're going to catch juvenile fish on the grass beds, look at the more community structure, and then Ron's going to look at directed fishing towards snook with this trammel net. So we're pretty much ready to roll.
Let's go.
All right.
Most marine fish spend at least a portion of their life cycle in seagrass meadows, which makes these habitats particularly important for sampling juvenile fish. I accompanied Brent and his research team as they used a 70-foot seine net to sample the fish community, which is only one of several techniques they use.
And that's what's interesting about our program is we use a multi-gear approach, which allows us to collect all different life stages of various species, and that allows us to track the fish throughout its life cycle.
Our catch includes dozens of species and illustrates the high diversity of fish that utilize seagrass meadows. Nearly 300 species of fish have been identified in seagrass meadows from the Tampa Bay area. Each species caught is identified, carefully measured, and recorded into a database used to assess the health of the fisheries community. Brent and I took a closer look at some different types of fish. We examined several species of baitfish, including some lively pinfish, which get their name from the sharp spines on their dorsal and pelvic fins. We also looked at a mohara, which possesses a mouth that extends downward as an adaptation for feeding on the bottom, and some minnow-like bay anchovies, which form large schools and feed on plankton in the water column. Another category we looked at was juvenile sport fish, which included the boldly striped sheepshead and the spotted sea trout, which utilizes seagrass meadows both as juveniles and as adults. Some other, more unusual species included the oyster toadfish, which is a bottom predator that possesses mildly venomous spines. We also looked at seahorses and pipefish, which, believe it or not, are true fish with body shapes that are uniquely adapted to clinging to seagrasses. An odd characteristic of these two species is that males carry developing young in brood pouches, as seen in these two examples. And finally, we examined some southern pufferfish, which inflate themselves in efforts to frighten potential predators, and which have been known to concentrate dangerous toxins that can cause serious illness if eaten by humans.
I think that's about it, Marty.
Thanks, Brian.
You bet, it's our pleasure.
Great. We just had an opportunity to take a look at the seagrass beds and the importance of them for a community of fish, particularly the juveniles. Next, let's target a particular species, the snook. We used a very different approach to capture adult snook, which included deploying a trawl net from a moving boat. We caught a number of snook ranging from small to large. Interestingly, as snook get older, sex may change from male to female, and reproductive females are typically the largest individuals. Tagging and monitoring adult snook is one method used to learn more about the ecology of this important sport fish. And understanding the ecology of a species is critical for developing effective management strategies. With the research that you've been doing, you've been tracking or monitoring the snook on the west coast here. Tell me a little bit about what some of the things you found, what you've learned.
Well, it's interesting that fish in Tampa Bay don't leave Tampa Bay. Fish in Sarasota Bay don't leave Sarasota Bay. Fish in Jupiter Inlet, Loxahatchee Estuary, will go as far south as Alligator Lake, which is down there by Flamingo. So East Coast snook seem to travel greater distances than do West Coast snook. They're estuarine, they're estuary specific. They have a natal estuary on the West Coast.
Ron, the data that you collect, how has the Fish and Wildlife Commission used that data?
Over time, you assemble large numbers of lengths and ages. You get a distribution of the size and ages of the fish simply by marking them and keeping up with that information. Snook are looked at. We have an annual stock assessment on snook. We do this every year. That's what the data is used for. It's to manage the fishery. If they're proper, in other words, if they fit the need, if they fit the bill, in other words, if they are appropriate to the problem, we should see some either increase in abundance, decrease in exploitation or fishing mortality. Either way is good for the population. We should see an increase in successful fishing for Florida's anglers.
Perhaps some of the marine life that evoke the greatest emotions in humans are the marine mammals. And I'm here at sort of the working heart of the marine mammal rescue and recovery operations at Mote Marine Lab with Dr. Randy Wells, the director for the Center for Marine Mammal and Sea Turtle Research. How you doing, Randy?
Welcome to Mote, Marty.
Thanks. Hey, Randy, we just started talking a little bit about marine mammal rescue and recovery. Can you tell us a little bit about what Mote does?
Yeah, the Mote Marine Laboratory is a large laboratory that covers a lot of different aspects of marine biology, chemistry, ecology, and that sort of thing. This particular facility is engaged in research on marine mammals, both in the field and those that come to our whale and dolphin hospital. It's at this hospital that we take care of dolphins and whales that have come up on the beach. We're able to try to put them back together again. We have an excellent veterinary staff that is able to treat the animals in our critical care facility over here behind us, and then once they are ready to go back out into the wild, they have a period of time in this lagoon that's right behind us where they get their strength back, demonstrate their abilities, and go through a drug clearance before they go back out into the wild.
Can you tell me a little bit about some of the basic biology of dolphins? For instance, in Sarasota Bay, do we have resident bottlenose dolphins?
Sure. Sarasota Bay is the place where we actually first discovered that bottlenose dolphins can be residents to areas. Prior to the beginning of our work in 1970, nobody knew whether or not they ranged throughout ocean basins or whether they were resident to particular sections of the coastline.
Approximately how long does a dolphin live, and how long to reproductive maturity, and how many offspring can you anticipate from a female?
Those are really good questions and ones we've been able to address here in Sarasota Bay. With our studies here in Sarasota, we've learned that bottlenose dolphins can live as long as 52 years. That's the oldest ones on record. We actually have two 52-year-old females out here in the bay right now. We've seen within the last week that each have 4-year-old calves with them. They reach sexual maturity as females when they're about 6 to 8 years of age. They begin producing young, and they keep producing young until they're in their late 40s. It's a pretty phenomenal reproductive strategy.
It is. Do they tend to reproduce every year or every other year? Or?
Typically what we see is that the mothers and the young stay together for about 3 to 6 years, and it's about the time of the birth of the next calf that we see separation between a mother and her current calf.
So approximately every 3 to 6 years.
Right.
Of course, the bottlenose dolphin is our state marine mammal and the one we most commonly see, but there's another dolphin that might be observed in Florida coastal waters, the Atlantic spotted dolphin, I believe?
That's correct. If you go out from this shoreline, the west coast of Florida, if you go out about 8 miles or so, you may begin to see Atlantic spotted dolphins over the continental shelf waters.
Now, I know there are some other marine mammals, too, that occur in Florida waters, some of which include right whales that calve off the northeast corner of the state. But can you tell me a little bit about some of the other marine mammals that frequent Florida's waters?
In the waters of the west coast of Florida, the primary marine mammal that we see in addition to the bottlenose dolphin is the Florida manatee. And we know the manatee to be one of those that is most vulnerable to human activities. About 25% of the manatees that are killed each year die at the hands of humans operating vessels out there. Vessel collisions are responsible for many, many deaths. But during the summer months, we see manatees in the waters around here. During the winter months, they'll be found in warm water areas such as warm springs and around power plants where there's warm water effluent that comes out.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the conservation issues surrounding marine mammals. Well, we mentioned a little bit about manatees and boat accidents. What about dolphins? Fishing, now that we've gotten rid of gill netting, has that improved things for dolphins?
It may have done a little bit. Even before the gill net ban went into effect, recreational fishing was probably a bigger source of mortality and injury to bottlenose dolphins in this area than fishing nets. We still find a number of dolphins coming in that have been entangled in discarded fishing gear or that have ingested terminal tackle and either strangled themselves with the line that's gotten around their epiglottal beak, the connection between the blowhole and the lungs, or other complications from swallowing fishing gear. So discarded or poorly maintained terminal tackle are causes of a high number of mortalities for dolphins in Florida waters.
Well, that kind of drives home the issue of individual responsibility or individual efforts that what we can do as fishermen.
Exactly.
And would be to try to be careful about losing gear overboard, I would think.
Definitely. This is these animals' homes. We go out there for a good time, but these animals have to live out there, and what they encounter is what they have to live with. It's especially the young animals that have problems with this, those that haven't developed the experience over time, and we need to do what we can to be careful of what we put into their environment that can affect them.
There are 7 species of seagrasses that occur in Florida coastal waters, 4 of which are common. These include shoal grass, which can grow in very shallow areas, widgeon grass, which can grow both in freshwater and in saltwater and is an important food for migratory waterfowl, turtle grass, which is an important food for green sea turtles, and manatee grass, which, as the name implies, is an important food of the manatee. And seagrasses provide habitat for a lot of species, but perhaps one of the species that people are most concerned about in Florida estuaries is the Florida manatee. With me today is Tom Pitchford, a manatee biologist with the Florida Marine Research Institute. Tom, can you tell me a little bit about the habitat requirements of manatees?
Well, Marty, manatees are wide-ranging animals. They cover essentially all of the water in Florida. That means you might find a manatee in a river, the estuaries, or in the Atlantic or Gulf Coast. Manatees can move equally from salt to fresh water, and what they really require is expansive areas of seagrass beds and quiet areas where they go to give birth and nurse their young.
I understand that they also need areas where they can go where the water is warmer during the winter.
That's right. Manatees are tropically evolved animals, and really winter temperatures in Florida are just a little bit too low in the northern parts of Florida to sustain them. So they do seek out warm water sites. That's either natural springs where the groundwater is warmer than the ambient water, or the industrial effluents from power plants where the warm water sustains them through the winter.
Now, manatees are long-lived animals. Can you give me a little bit of your thoughts on that or insight into the population biology of manatees?
Manatees are extremely long-lived animals. So we have some animals that have lived up 35 years in the wild, and there's an animal in captivity that's more than 50 years old. So that's a long lifespan. The female producing calves at every 2 to 3 years. If manatees are allowed to live their entire lifespan, that's a good sign in terms of the number of calves that they could produce.
Now, in terms of living their lifespan, of course, there are probably a number of things that influence that, but human activity tends to be the number one that we hear about.
That's right. We have a program to keep track of cause of death. It's an important benchmark to know how manatees are doing. We essentially need to know, with all our protective strategies, if we're doing a good job. We know that manatees can be killed by collisions with watercraft. That's in fact the leading cause when a cause of death is identified.
Now, in terms of the boat impacts, of course, that's what we hear the most about in the controversy over manatee speed zones. Can you give me some sort of a feel? I understand that, well, 25% of all the manatees that you've documented, the mortality is due to boat collisions.
That's right. We've been keeping track for more than 25 years of what kills manatees. And in that time, it's in any given year, about 25% of the manatees that are recovered dead are killed by collisions with boats.
Tom, what does the future for the Florida manatee look like?
Well, I'm optimistic. In some areas of the state, from our adult survival rates, we know that the population is growing. Some of the areas of the state we don't know yet, so we're cautiously optimistic that the state is doing well, but we don't know for certain. We need to look at all of the tools that are available to us.
The preceding was a short sample of the curriculum for the Florida Master Naturalist Program series. For more information, visit the Florida Master Naturalist Program website or contact your local University of Florida County Extension office.